Hello friends, welcome back to another Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. The date is Thursday, the 5th of November, and at this moment we don't know exactly who the next US president will be, though we have strong suspicions. My name is Alex O'Healy, I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil. This podcast is also Philip Cunliffe and George Hoare, who are in the UK. So today we're going to be talking about Germany, which is a country we maybe haven't had enough occasion to discuss. And that itself is probably testament to the fact that it's been relatively stable over the past couple of years, all the while countries around it have been far more buffeted by economic crisis, populist upsurges, and so on. Actually, we've ended up with a weird situation in which Angela Merkel has inherited the title of leader of the free world, which is something that probably not many people saw coming about a decade ago.
Though she might be about to lose it once again back to its rightful owners.
Its rightful place in Washington.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, so it's I'm excited about this episode because we've discussed Europe a lot, obviously, at least in the form of the European Union. We've spoken about it with reference to France. We've spoken about Brexit and Ireland and from the Mediterranean in general, but not much from the perspective of Europe's new imperial center in Berlin. So it's good. I mean, it's fantastic to have the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. I will now actually pass over to George because he's produced this episode and he will introduce our guest.
Yeah, thanks. We're delighted to be joined today by Wolfgang Streeck, one of Germany's leading public intellectuals and emeritus director of the Max Planck Institute in Cologne. And we're going to be talking today about Wolfgang's recent book, which is out now from Verso, which is called Critical Encounters, Capitalism, Democracy, Ideas, which is a collection of book reviews on a wide range of subjects, including the past and future of capitalism, European politics, the nature of democracy, and the history of ideas. And so one of the challenges in planning this episode, in which we also want to talk about Wolfgang's previous books, Buying Time and How Will Capitalism End, was essentially trying to focus on a manageable number of subjects for a podcast discussion. So yeah, we will try and focus in on some of the key questions, I guess, about Germany and the EU. But before we move on to those main topics of conversation, I wanted to ask you, Wolfgang, and welcome to the podcast, about the book review as a medium of conversation. What do you think are its strengths and weaknesses? What are the kind of opportunities and irritations or limitations in book reviews?
Yeah, that is a very important question. The book is a collection of book reviews, which at the first glance may not be the usual thing that you get when you read something in social science or social criticism. The point is that I came to the conclusion that we are today not in a world in which we can aspire to giving a synthetic theoretical account of what is happening in the world. But what we do have is a lot of different angles and perspectives that cannot easily be synthesized at this point, but all of which make sense and teach us something about the world. And then the book is an important medium for this, partly because precisely because if it's well written, then it contains aspects that are not exploited or ended or finally sealed in the summary of a book, but that pop up sort of by themselves in the pursuit of a particular subject. And it strikes readers, or me very often, that there are things that are in this sense sort of very valuable ideas and observations that can be sort of further developed by integrating them into a different analytical context, namely the context that is sort of the baggage, the conceptual baggage that is in the brain of the reader. And from this, you develop something like a dialogue with the book. The reader of a book adds things, perspectives, ideas to the book by using the unfinished ideas and integrating them into a different context. I give you one example from this book. The first review in the book is Freeman's fantastic, magnificent history of the factory. And I was struck by this as a sort of lifelong aficionado of automobile factories, beginning something like 60 years ago. And so now this really magnificent book has one, if you want, open part, which is that Freeman knows everything about Anglo-American automobile factories, and I learned an enormous amount from it, but much less on German and French automobile factories. Now this was a place where I spent some time, in addition to spending time at British, in particular British automobile. And then you learn something. You learn something about your own experience by comparing it to the raw material presented by a book on a different aspect of this. So give you one example, and then we can sort of move on to less methodological things. So for example, Freeman, in a sort of very, very interesting move he makes, explains why automobile factories, especially in the United States, became increasingly small or became ever smaller in the 1980s and 1990s. That was in order to make sure that there was a greenfield site, so artificially collected workforces, so to speak. And that was because they had the strike experience and the militancy of labor, and they thought they could manage this better in small factories. Now, in my experience in Germany, the factories never got smaller. In fact, Wolfsburg, main Volkswagen factory, still has roughly 50,000 workers. 50,000 workers working in two shifts. And just imagine the sheer logistics of this. And so why didn't they? And the answer is, which I could contribute to this debate, that in Germany the strength of the unions was such that they could prevent the splitting up of this factory, and they insisted that that factory was permanently renewed, rebuilt, new investment put in, and that the 50,000 people were basically kept in that place who were living around and so on. So that's something you can sort of add to a book when you read it, and then when you review it, you suddenly have a new theoretical idea. The size of factories as a function of the strength of management, and or in industrial peace, if you want. And in Freeman, you then find that the Chinese factories that produce the iPhone have, I think, 200,000 workers, where it is not a matter of unit strength, but a matter of management strength. They can house them in dormitories and call them out anytime that the American Apple company sort of wants to speed up production. So that's one example of how you can.
No, I think also a good book review makes the reader of the review want to go ahead and read the book as well, which is that review of yours certainly did as well. But I think flowing on from your point about German unions, Alex, you had a question about German politics.
Yeah, well, we should, I guess, move on to the meat of this, which is one of the things that we wanted to discuss with you, Wolfgang, is one of the main analytical questions that you focus on in a lot of the reviews is the development of the European Union and its politics and economics, and in particular the role of Germany within it. And I wondered if you could, maybe to start us off on this section, give our listeners a bit of an overview of Germany's history with regard to the EU since the 1990s. I think one thing that you really helpfully remind us in the process of these reviews in the book is that mid-90s Germany was the sick man of Europe, which I think many people, perhaps of my age, sort of in their 30s, don't know or will have forgotten about. But that then, after the 2008 crisis, Germany experiences what you call a second Wirtschaftswunder, a second economic miracle. So maybe you could talk us through this recent history just to set us off.
Yeah, that is, of course, a really long story. But Germany, see, Germany used to be described by the British, especially the British press, the Economist in particular. Every 10 years, it was described as the sick man of Europe that was about to sort of fall dead immediately. And that was so in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and then at the beginning of the 2000s. In part, this was because they didn't understand how this country works. And one of the essays in the book, I'm trying to introduce history in this, not just one system like the German system working in a particular way, but the historical circumstances that where the condition under which these things that from the outside you observe as growth and whatever, and to a very large extent, in one of those essays, I argue that what Perry Anderson calls the second capitalist revolution, that is the detraditionalization of a society, the destruction of traditional social structures that could be resistant to markets and capitalist modernization. That was something that took place after 1945, after the defeat of, or the complete, total defeat of Germany, and the influx in West Germany in West Germany, there were, I think, 50 million people still alive, and then 10 million were flowing in as refugees and expellees from the rest from what used to be Germany, and then became Poland or Russia or Czechoslovakia and so on. And this sort of enormous unscrambling of a traditional society opened it up to competition, the destruction of traditional milieus, even the reorganization of, for example, trade unionism. Trade unionism was politically and confessionally divided in the Weimar Republic. And then suddenly Germany after 1945, when the difference between Catholics and Protestants totally disappeared, because the Protestants from the East now lived in areas that used to be completely Catholic, like the Rhineland, and vice versa. Sometimes Catholics settled in, let's say, in northern Germany. And if you can imagine as a sociologist how this sort of complete unscrambling of a society, that made for an enormous capacity to adjust to changing circumstances. It also introduced 10 million people who had to work their butts off in order to be able to make a living in a society that was essentially hostile to them, because they had nothing to eat either. I was born in a refugee camp in 1946, and I can testify to how complicated it was for my parents actually to ensure that I got something to eat. Yeah. That is something that is completely, at the first glance, unimaginable to people today. How and it has to be taken into account if you want to understand how that society works. In a more sort of recent way, one could speak of the European Union, but you have questions on this, and I would like to integrate the German perspective into the European Union of the 1990s.
Yeah, but I mean, feel free to go ahead and explain that now. See,
Germany is the only country in Europe that in 1990 became larger. Nation states do not normally integrate. in this case, basically they sometimes break apart. Separatism is much more important than unification. Germany was an exception, and in 1990 it became bigger. Now it also had an enormous burden economically in order to somehow accommodate people in the East. It turned out that basically industry in Eastern Germany was a museum, an industrial museum. It was completely uncompetitive. At the same time, the East Germans demanded to be included in the German mark, the currency, on a one-to-one basis. So one East German mark was became one West German mark. The result was that they were even more uncompetitive as a country, because they would have had to basically devaluate their currency against the West German currency, which they couldn't. That experience, in many ways, was then repeated in the monetary union, where Italy and other countries joined monetary union on a level that was from the beginning not what it should have been. It was far too high, and at this point one can say that while the 1990s were a hard time for Germany, with unemployment reaching up to 20% in East Germany, and then also in West Germany, the European Monetary Union became the big success for the German economy, because it allowed this economy that always had been oriented towards exports since the Kaiserreich, since the late 19th century, to work with an undervalued currency up to the present day. If Germany had its own currency, it would, I think, revalue upwards roughly 20-25%. But since these other countries are part of the euro is undervalued from the German perspective and overvalued from the Italian perspective. And now imagine what this means for the European Union. It sets up a battle between the losers and the winners, the winner being Germany, and the losers being the Mediterranean countries, now including France. France is always a country that can't decide whether it's Northern European or Mediterranean. Now it has become much more Mediterranean. Let me say something on the question that you asked at the outset, or in your mail. How come that countries like Italy and Spain and Greece are still in that euro? Why don't they leave? And here, I think we learn that we should not treat countries as unities. There is Italy, there is, but they are divided between different classes and between the population and the elite. Now, historically, we know a little more about how the euro came about in the 1990s, and it was basically a French project. The French had to devalue their currency against the German mark all the time, every 5 or 6 years, and they didn't like that. Especially then they tried to impose capital controls in the early 1980s, which failed, and Mitterrand then turned completely around. The idea he shared with the Italian government at the time was the following: we introduce a common currency with the Germans, so thereby we can avoid having to devalue against the German currency. At the same time, our own industry will suffer. We accept that because we want a restructuring of our industry anyway. This has never worked because the communists in Italy and the communists in France have always stood in the way of a thorough capitalist rationalization, on competitive rationalization of our political economies. But if they can no longer hope that we will monetarily accommodate their resistance to restructuring, as it was called in the 1990s, then they will have to give in. And we will be, like the Germans, a modern society with a modern economy, and we will be competitive.
I think there's just so much rich detail in there, but just to, I guess, to clarify this point about, I guess, say Spanish and Italian support for the European Union, support for the idea of Europe, and, you know, notwithstanding your point about talking about classes, not about nations as kind of unitary things. And before moving back to talking about Germany more directly again, what do you think does explain the consistently high levels of support for an idea of Europe or a European project in countries which seem to be, at least within the Eurozone, to be particularly disadvantaged by it?
Yeah. But of course, historically, they thought they would be advantaged, not disadvantaged. And now they are in. And it's the Americans have this expression, you maybe in English too, you paint yourself into a corner. It is extremely difficult to get out of a common currency because people have invested in it. That's only part of the explanation. What I now think is that the euro, as seen from France and Italy and Spain in particular, was an elite project. And in the Italian case, of an elite, also Greece, incidentally, that had basically given up on the idea that they could on their own govern their country.
Right.
And then the idea was to go to sort of Germany and buy in, or Northern Europe, and buy in Northern European state capacity by subscribing to the same currency. In Italian, this was called the vincolo esterno, the external constraint of vincolo. Vincolo is fetter, and this term appears in the 1990s in the elite dialogue in Italy all the time. You find it in the memoirs of the various finance ministers, that where it is completely used as a matter of course. Our society is ungovernable, and we need a vincolo esterno in order to impose proper capitalist discipline on our country. Now then, 20 years into the euro, what they learn and what they have learned is that this sort of politics fails. And it fails because it calls forth popular resistance that they now call populist. And that this sort of resistance against this sort of imposed modernization from above prevents the positive effect that they expected to get from imposing a hard German currency on their economies. Now then the question becomes, what now? Can you turn around and tell your people that now we have to take the giant risk? Yanis, what's his name in Greece? He understood. He tried to do this and then had to learn that the Greek population would not be willing to take the enormous risk Varoufakis, to get out of the euro. Now, if you can't take that risk as a political elite, what do? And in my view, what you now see is a turnaround. Rather than using the euro as an external constraint on their own economy, they try to stay inside the euro and squeeze out of the North as much in terms of monetary, fiscal, all sorts of sort of support. You can also say collective welfare that goes to the state, and the state then can use it to buy support in their own country. In other words, it now becomes a situation where you get an extreme dependence on an imperial leader, which turns out to be Germany, and on the willingness of that leader to convince its own voters to agree to some sort of social compensation or social transfer in exchange for these countries keeping their markets open for the German export industry. Yeah. And what you see now in terms of the COVID-19 recovery and resilience fund is exactly this. The money goes to the governments, not to the people, because the European Union can give money only to the governments. What do the governments do with it? They will get the money sometime in next year, the middle of next year. They build railways, they build this and that. It's all sort of a possibility to satisfy certain constituencies out of money that they can't tax their own people, because otherwise they run away.
Yeah, I think linking the EU projects to elites giving up on governing their own countries or seeing their own countries as ungovernable is an absolutely that's such a central point, and I think extremely clearly put as well. But back to Germany, though, I think Alex has a follow up on the.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was interested to hear you, Wolfgang, speak about the idea on the European periphery of wanting to become a normal country, which is something that we've discussed on the podcast before. And a note to listeners, that's episode 153, most recently, where we've discussed that in relation to Italy. And I guess in that, there's a sort of imagination about what Germany is like, that Germany is this normal country, is this orderly country. So that might be a good moment to pivot to discussing some myths about Germany. And I think you devote some time in the book to quashing maybe two different myths about that people have about Germany. The first one is about ordoliberalism, the idea that Germany is this strict disciplinarian, wedded to these ideas by which the state must make markets work competitively. And then you have this other myth, perhaps, which is the idea of social partnership. Which would be the idea that Germany is this great social democratic society in which labor and capital walk hand in hand. So maybe you could tell us a little bit, first of all, what ordoliberalism and social partnership respectively represent, and how neither of those perhaps capture the German reality.
Yeah, that is, again, I could probably teach a seminar on this. The short part of it is the following. The post-war decades in Germany, as in many other countries, were a time when the working class and trade unions were more powerful than they had been before the war, and more powerful than they now are. And that has something to do essentially with the relationship between elites and masses. And in the victorious countries, the elites had to be grateful to the working class, willing to defend their country in the trenches and sacrifice their lives for the country. In my view, that is a lot of the explanation of the British welfare state after 1945 and of the American New Deal during the war and thereafter. In the countries that they were defeated, the old elites had lost all respect and all influence. And what sort of came in was the social democratic reformist left. Yeah. So in Germany, then you had sort of embodied in the two wings of the Christian Democratic Party. There was sort of social Catholicism on the one hand, linked up with sort of centrist trade unionism. And in the economics ministry, that was the labor ministry. The economics ministry, you had these ordo-liberals who were anti-statist and pro-market, but at the same time understood that markets need to be institutionalized and that you need a politics of market in order to have markets. These people were very smart, so they knew that for a certain period, they had to allow a politics that also included, that was labor inclusive, as you say in the United States, that included the Ministry of Labor and the Ministry of the Economy, so they had to work together. This thing became to be called soziale Marktwirtschaft, the social market economy, a compromise between the two. Yeah. Now that was something that carried very well into the 1970s, 1980s with the Social Democratic Chancellors Brandt and Schmidt, and Helmut Kohl was sort of coming from the Catholic wing of the Christian Democratic Party, and he was seen at the time as a counterpart to Thatcher. Remember, Thatcher was introducing neoliberalism, and Kohl was sort of trying to work with the trade unions.
Yeah.
Now we get into the 1990s, and the 1990s, as I said, Germany was in a very big economic crisis after unification, and the euro was coming, and at that time, sort of the linkage between the union wing of German politics and the business wing changed in a very dramatic way. It was the period of globalization and of what Danny Rodrik calls hyperglobalization. When capital became so mobile, being able to go to Eastern Europe, being able to go to the rest of the world, even to China, and so the cooperative relationship, which was negotiated cooperation well into the 1970s, turned into a very sort of hegemonic cooperation where, and I remember this very well from my own research, where companies used to tell their previously powerful trade union leaders or works councils, look, if you ask too much, we can produce this car in Hungary. And Hungary will shortly be a member of the European internal market. That means there will be no, there's not even a currency risk involved. Yeah. So what I call sort of dependent social partnership, from, let's say, negotiated social partnership, which in part was really something that was on the same plane, especially as long as the federal government was sort of mediating between the two. Then, with globalization and with the opening of the exit option for business, this thing switched without it being necessarily visible from the outside. Yeah.
So that would be the reason that there'd be this kind of myth still that the working class is far better off in Germany, that's far more institutionalized, that it still has a voice, when the reality is quite different. So, I mean, following on from that, what does the German working class gain currently from this arrangement? Why are German unions still wedded to sustaining German export predominance?
Very important. Very important. We are still an over-industrialized country compared by other countries. With other countries. With the Germany is sort of frozen into this export world championship role due to what I mentioned first, the very favorable exchange rate that we have now under the euro. And if you want to understand how the labor business dynamics now work, is that they understand that they have to work together in order to remain competitive in international markets, using the enormous advantage that is offered to them by the monetary construction of the euro. So you will find now what used to be adversarial collective bargaining at the company level as well as at the national level has now become a sort of cooperative exploration of what is necessary for that particular sector or company to maintain its superiority over other countries and firms in other countries in world markets. Yeah, Volkswagen during this period became the biggest automobile producer in the world, bigger than Toyota. And why? Because the established institutions of let's say, cooperative conflict or conflictual cooperation under this combination of opportunities and constraints offered by the euro turned into cooperative cooperation, no longer conflictual cooperation. That's why for the last 20, 25 years, you haven't seen a major strike in Germany anymore, except in airlines and these things, which is not war. Yeah, the auto industry now is completely cooperative in terms of maintaining international competitive advantage.
It's fascinating to hear ideas that are so rarely kind of discussed. The idea that Germany is over-industrialized and the idea that its unions have shifted between two models of cooperation from, like you say, conflictual to cooperative cooperation, in effect. I wanted to move on to one interview in particular in the book, which I thought was fabulous. One review in the book called Scenario for a Wonderful Tomorrow, where you discuss in some depth a particular style of Angela Merkel's leadership. Yeah. And this was interesting to me because it was in reading it that I realized how we only hear positive things about Merkel in the Anglophone press. And famously, she inherited the mantle of leader of the free world, even in the last 4 years.
Yeah.
So what I was fascinated by in particular was this leader who combines these these incredible instincts for political opportunity with a complete lack of long-term vision and strategy. Yeah. And I thought this was, it was a fascinating dynamic. And I wondered if you could talk us through that, specifically with reference to her shifts on Germany's nuclear energy policies and also the role that she played in the Syrian refugee crisis in particular.
Yeah, I would want to get away from the, first of all, but of course, people, individuals, characters always play a role. But in order to understand this, one has to take a little step back and look at the general situation of centrist conservative politics and parties in Europe after the 1990s. And there you see that in order to keep these countries, these parties able to govern, you needed an enormous amount of, let's call it flexibility. Our societies in Britain, you know this too, but since you have a long colonial history, that stands out less in a less sort of surprising way. In Germany, it is clear that with the mobilization of everyone into how do you say, wage labor, you need to have a population policy that can only include a lot of immigration.
Yeah.
There's no way you can. So you can't even today. If you're old, you go to a home for the aged. You get personal care. But people who work there are from Czechoslovakia. They are from wherever. But they are not from Germany.
Yeah.
So you have enormous number of growing segments where of the service sector where you need immigration. Now explain to a conservative party that Germany is now ein Einwanderungsland, an immigration country. The Christian Democratic Party was not able to digest this. They denied it until 2015. In fact, for Merkel and her main constituency in industry, plus her opening to what they call a modern family, that was also needed. These parties were losing women voters. So they needed to sort of change the idea of what a family is. That would include that women work for money in the market, and that they are basically on the same plane as men in the world of work. Now then, having emphasized this in order to prevent enormous losses in electoral terms, she had to have an immigration policy. But her party denied her an immigration policy. Early in 2015, one of the big consulting firms in Germany, who always worked for the government, sort of delivered a report under which Germany would need 2 million immigrants per year in the next 15 years in order to maintain a proper size of its workforce. Yeah, that report was suppressed because the party couldn't possibly digest it. Yeah. But when there was this Syrian crisis, there was an idea to combine sort of the economic need, which was completely there, with sort of Christian willingness to give to the poor.
Yeah.
And then the border was opened in a dramatic move. And something happened that was sort of unexpected. Now so the German press is not very investigative, but now we know a few things about this. The order to the border police was like open on Saturday and be closed on Monday. And on Monday, there was this sort of enormous outbreak of charitable feelings in Germany when the masses came in, and Germany was described as the country that had finally shed its past. And people were absolutely excited. And then the decree to close the border again was not signed. So within a very short period, we had 1 million immigrants. 1 million within 3 or 4 months, yeah. Which resulted in the rise of the AfD, the AfD, which had been on the decline in the first half of 2015, which resulted in the chancellor going to Istanbul or to Ankara to make the deal with the Turks that the Turks would stop the inflow. In exchange for several billion euros to be paid nominally by the European Union, but de facto by Germany. Yeah. Now that is a sort of flexibility that not every political leader is capable of mobilizing. You see, but the enormous capacity of this person to do the things that a conservative party needs to do under the pressure of globalization and the need for modernization and for capital accumulation to continue. The enormous flexibility that she has to do this is just amazing. It is helped by the German political system in many ways, but it enabled the Christian Democratic Union as one of the last centrist Christian democratic parties of the continent to survive and to govern for 25 more years in a row.
So this strikes me, this is also part of Angela Merkel's growing domination of the CDU, and you liken her, or you say, in fact, the Germany system has become more presidential under her leadership.
Yeah. In fact, she has given up the party chairmanship about a year ago and enthroned a successor who she herself threw out half a year later.
Yes. Yeah.
And now you have three very weak characters rivaling for the party leadership without any guarantee that they will also be the candidate for chancellor. And Merkel is basically doing what she wants. So she's sort of above the parties, which is something that she always would like to do. Very often taking some of the favorite themes of the Social Democratic Party away from them and making them her own program, which for the Social Democrats was the most mixed blessing that can happen to you. They got their way, but they were sort of sidelined, and they didn't get the credit for it. So you, in my view, if a historian in 10 years from now was to write a political history of Germany in the era of Angela Merkel, they would be they would have to be extremely admirative of her capacity to change policies between like nothing, and she was able to sell it, partly by not selling it because she never talks about it. The great advantage that the German chancellor has over a British prime minister is that she never has to go to the parliament to be questioned.
Yeah.
In your parliament, there is the leader of the opposition and the prime minister. They face each other 10 meters apart, and the opposition leader can ask questions, and the prime minister has to answer them. Angela Merkel would never do this. She doesn't have to do this.
Yes, just to, I guess, change tack a little bit and bring things right up to the present day, because I think one of the most interesting parts of the book is the 6 monthly letters from Europe, which kind of go December 2019 through May 2020, that give, I guess, some of your commentary on current events. And obviously coronavirus features heavily, particularly in the later ones. And what do you think COVID has revealed about the EU, particularly ideas of European solidarity, which you focus on, and the role and the function of EU politics?
Yeah, of course, it's as Joe Enlai used to say when he was asked in a press conference in first time in America what he thought about the French Revolution. He said, "I think it's too early to tell." Yeah. And that applies, of course, to this also. But if you want my hunches, generally I have this idea, and it's not a very original idea, that COVID accelerates trends that had already been there, rather than changing things in a fundamental way. And as far as Europe is concerned, it is completely obvious, and was completely obvious, that the European Union played no role whatsoever in fighting this epidemic. It just wasn't there. It was the nation states that had to do what they could, and they couldn't do very much. At the European level, the nation states hadn't learned from previous viruses that making preparations for such a thing would have been a very good idea, but nobody had done so. The European Union never even slightly sort of reminded them that something like that could happen. In my view, I'm writing a book right now under the title of Between Globalism and Democracy. In my view, this COVID thing can be understood in the following way. It can be endogenized into the capitalist expansion and globalization process, the hyperglobalization process of the 1990s and later. If you build up these enormously fast and efficient lines of communication between continents, between countries, and so on, if you then sort of distribute production all over the globe, so that these lines have to be used every day, then you invite these let's say very, very small enemies of the people to travel wherever they want. And especially if you, as some people have now interestingly argued, if you destroy the habitats of animals that used to carry these viruses without much problem for them, then you invite this process. Now, in business, we know that in order to embark on a risky enterprise, you have to set money aside as an insurance, just in case something happens. For example, the German nuclear energy industry was forced by the Greens, essentially mobilizing for it, to set aside money during the operation of a nuclear power plant to settle the costs, to pay for the dismantling of the power plant after it was no longer functioning. Now, this sort of thing never happened in globalization, even and also in financial globalization. Incidentally, the 2008 crisis was a crisis of a circuit of money sort of flowing around the world from the American housing market into the public banking system of Germany, and nobody had ever calculated the real costs, which would include the insurance against the disastrous consequences that could happen. So here we have a situation of extremely risky, risk-ridden system without an insurance system. And the European Union had nothing to contribute to this problem in the same way as the nation states had. Now, then you saw in the first wave how a country like Germany, which for some reason still has a well-functioning and well-funded healthcare system, sort of performed so much better than countries with either an underfunded healthcare system, Britain and Italy, or a highly funded but extremely centralized system like France, and of course the British system is also extremely centralized. And you had this sort of decentralized system in Germany, very well funded, which could basically work with it, which resulted in an enormous tension between countries. So, for example, the Italians and the French wanted German part of the German face masks that the Germans had at least accumulated, knowing that something like this could be coming. And then you had these, again, the Merkel government. You had these public relations exercises under which 10 Italian half-dead COVID patients were flown to German hospitals, which still had intensive care beds, and also 20 Frenchmen. And this was sort of posted on television as a sort of contribution to European solidarity. Yeah. Mm. And then everybody had to be grateful to the Germans for sharing their resources. So yes. Now then, I'm in politics or in government policy, you have to basically hit different flies with the same whatever you hit a fly with. So
rolled up newspaper, fly swap.
Yeah. In Italy, there was this guy Salvini, who was seriously threatening to disrupt the euro. Whether he would have done this is a different matter. We, the French and the Germans, had with great effort sort of kicked Salvini out of the government and brought in the old centrist social democratic government, which sort of is devoted to the euro for reasons that I think I have understood. So now in Italy, when this enormous disparity between Italy and Germany became visible again, the mood went into the direction of let's tell them the truth, and Salvini will do it. At this moment, Merkel completely 180 degrees turned around on the European Union, taking up credit in order to distribute among the countries. Yeah, the French had tried to get the Germans to do this for years since Macron was in power, and the Germans had always told him that this was illegal. It wasn't in the treaties. It couldn't be done, and it couldn't be sold to the German electorate. But with the pictures, the videos from Italy, where they didn't have a place for the coffins anymore, the German public was willing to tolerate the what's it called? The Recovery and Resilience Fund. 750 billion. Interesting, since this is actually not allowed under the treaties, each country gets a bite, something. Even the smallest one, even where there is no COVID patient inside. Huh. Yeah, everybody gets something. And suddenly Germany took this 180 degrees turn. This is something that not everybody can do. Yeah. Now the German finance minister explains that the 750 billion will have to be repaid partly by the countries that receive the money, and partly by the European Union raising taxes for the first time, direct taxes that go to Brussels. None of this will happen. They will refund it by taking up new taxes in 7 years. Yeah, as the nation states have done all the time.
It's interesting. I mean, witnessing this whole all this sort of spectacle in Europe, that you'd think that even the hardest sovereigntist would accept some would think that the one place the EU should work, or some form of international European cooperation should be with a crisis like this. And even then, it doesn't really come together. So I mean, it's quite remarkable and quite damning. But I wanted to move from the very small enemies of the people, as you delightfully called it, to some rather bigger ideas. So regular listeners will know that Aufhebunga Bunga is the podcast at the end of history. And so we wanted to take this opportunity that you've joined us today to discuss with you how Germany fits into this story. So I think to me, and again, correct me if I'm wrong with this, but Germany seems to me to be the most end of history country, the country that has most embraced the end of history. Perhaps, for obvious reasons, that the carnage of the 20th century taught it lessons that, it shouldn't seek any big utopias of any stripe, and instead should focus on creating a stable society, focused on commerce, not on any heroic ideals, politics that should be about compromise, about consensus, not about any grand victory. And of course, nationalism is ruled out, both for Germany and for anyone else. And therefore, you find the emphasis on being European and the lesson that Germany always wants to teach its European neighbors, that, you have to be cooperative, you have to be European, and so on. And I think maybe you even see this with its emphasis on green politics, which is a sort of itself an emphasis on harmony, on moderation. So, I mean, first of all, do you agree with this depiction of Germany as the most end of history country? And consequently, if this captures what Germany has been like, especially for the past 3 decades, do you think that there's signs that this is coming apart in Germany as well? Because it certainly has done elsewhere, of course, in Britain, in Southern Europe, in the US. So is it maybe coming apart in Germany as well?
I think, Alex, the characterization is worth thinking about. Yes, the end of history, the end of history country. There is, without being able to explore this from the various angles that one might need, I would like to introduce a small word of caution in the following sense. See, Germany is the de facto hegemon of the European Union, in particular of the European Monetary Union. But as you quite rightly say, being hegemonic is not something that the Germans like and that they want to be seen, so to speak, as hegemonic. So they need the French. The whole idea about running the European Union is for the Germans to do it together with the French. The French, however, are still steeped in history, so to speak. They have enormous. They have a nuclear bomb. Yeah. Germany doesn't have one. They have post-colonial interests in West Africa that combine with interests in raw materials that you can get only there. They have, in addition, semi-colonial interests in the Middle East, in Lebanon, and places like this. The problem that the French have is that they don't have the economic resources to actually act like a regional hegemon.
Right. Yeah.
So they need the Germans. The Germans know that French hegemony can be expensive for the Germans, so to speak. So they want to have a say on what the resources are being used for. And the internal relationship between the French and the Germans is quite difficult. The French, for example, Trump, want the Germans to spend 2% of their gross domestic product on the military. Now we're spending 1.2%. That is almost doubling German military expenditure, which would mean that we alone would be spending more on the German military than the Russians on their own military, including their nuclear bomb. Yeah. So the German rearmament would only be conventional, not not nuclear, which would mean we would have a lot of German foot soldiers. They could be of great use for the French, who have an aircraft carrier and nuclear bombers, which are not very useful to fight local militants in West Africa. Right. So now the French are beginning to tell the Germans that if they still want to hide behind the French, they have to do something for it, which involves sending troops to Mali and these places, which we now do, but it has to be carefully hidden, and they are not allowed to engage in combat. They are only there to train the locals, so to speak. But that is a very difficult situation. That's a post-history position, right? Now, in order for under the German constitution as it stands now, sending German troops abroad requires a vote of the parliament. It cannot be done behind the wall. And the parliamentarians insist on this. So any move that the Germans do together with the French in order to build up a proper sort of modern hegemonic structure in Europe will have to be approved before the eyes of a population that is completely averse to German troops being deployed outside of Germany. I'm saying this in order to partly support your view on Germany being the end of history country, but it also, in connection with the French, may very well have to turn into the end of history, the end of the end of history country, in that they now have to learn to be a proper hegemonic state. My politics, in what I write in German, nobody listens anyway, but what I write is I'm an end of history man. I think the future for Europe must be a future, what the Germans ridiculously call of a Scandinavian future. I think a Scandinavian future is great. Countries that are armed only for self-defense, structurally incapable of military aggression, neutral between the emerging world powers of the United States and China, and trying to carve out a niche of peaceful cooperation between countries and with the rest of the world to the extent that this is possible. And put this into your end of history schema, and I think some interesting ideas can emerge.
So I suppose that takes us nicely into the question of neoliberalism. And one thing that we've talked about in the podcast, and one thing that you've talked about yourself, is also the end of the neoliberal form of capitalism. And you're quite insistent about that, not assuming that some kind of new form of regulation will necessarily emerge. And one thing that I've been very taken with in the work that you've developed, in not only in this most recent book, but also in your other book, How Will Capitalism End, is you suggest that we're in a kind of, or potentially in some kind of chaotic interregnum, or an age of determinacy, where we simply don't have the social and political actors or historic actors of any who have sufficient strength or capacity to shape society in ways that would make it more determinate and predictable. And you said, so you say the USA is the only one as a state, and it seems at the same time, in your words, too weak to enforce its own order while remaining strong enough to prevent others from enforcing theirs. So I was wondering if you could maybe expand a bit on this notion of an age of indeterminacy without any capacity for historic action.
Yes. I think that description is still valid. I would like to elaborate a little bit on the basis of what we have seen since. Now, this is a very short difference, and it's possibly only because I think that now, having read a few more things, I see something that needs to be added. That is the situation of China versus the United States. And if it is not very original to say that if there's one thing that we may be able to predict, then that the future world will be basically a pluricentric world where the United States on the one hand and China on the other hand will have to work out some kind of relationship between them, or they will be in bad trouble, at least the United States. So this is very, the starting point of the book that I'm writing now is an article that Karl Polanyi published in 1945 in a small intellectual journal in London. And there he says that there is a sort of historical window of opportunity. He doesn't use the word, of course, now for European countries, which in part he identifies with Britain. He says that racist colonialism is over and Europe has to learn to be a continent without colonies. He also says that the Stalinist Soviet Union has made an enormous change compared to the Soviet Union in the 1930s. It was no longer revolutionary. It just wanted to preserve its own area, but no longer expansionist. There was one problem still in the world, which was the expansionist United States, which believed that their way of life and their economy would be a recipe for the rest of the world. But Polanyi hoped that out of the internal contradictions of this system, they would also learn to limit themselves to, let's say, the area of the Monroe Doctrine, but otherwise leave everybody else alone. Now, compare this to today. The Soviet Union is gone, but China is a historically not imperialistic country. It wants its proper status, which and the United States under Trump, and I think in the future is on the way to withdraw from its historical expansionism and its idea that the world should be governed by the United States in order to become like the United States. They have enough problems at home. Regardless who's going to be the next president, I think they will be busy with their own country. But when they say America first, they mean we pay attention to America first, but not to the rest of the world. Yeah. So if that is true, then we have a question of how Europe can fit itself into this world. And Polanyi has the answer that having learned from the disaster of the gold standard in the 1930s, and having, of course, also learned from the disaster of the Second World War, after the end of fascism, the taming of communism, and hopefully the taming of American capitalism also, why not think about an area in the world that he calls an area of what he calls regional planning? The selective cooperation between smaller sovereign states that are democratic, and because they are democratic, they have to be free from external constraints on their money. In other words, they have to combine political and monetary sovereignty and develop a pattern of voluntary, cooperative relationships between neighboring states without a hierarchical dimension, with a horizontal dimension of cooperative relationships. Now, if I read this and I allow myself for a change to have an optimistic idea.
Yeah.
Just for a change. Then I'm not given to this sort of thing, but it is so exciting to think about robbing the European Union of its hierarchical dimension, and reducing it to what I call in the book a platform of voluntary cooperation between sovereign democracies, which a group of countries that has no imperial ambitions at all, that wants to defend itself, but you can defend yourself. Where, for example, you deal with terrorism as a police affair and not as something that has to be stopped in Mali by shooting some sort of Islamists in the desert. Yeah. Now that I look around and look at this. I see there's one sort of price to be paid for this, which Stalin, according to Polanyi, paid in 1945, and which he expected the Americans to pay also, which was that they would not essentially insist on others adopting the same philosophy and the same worldview as they. Yeah. In other words, that system would be tolerant, even where there are things that you cannot, starting from your own value system, that you cannot condone. So, looking at Europe today, that could mean that we would have a Europe that does not try to force on the Hungarians a population policy that fits for the Germans. Yeah. And a Europe that does not try to be the American watchdog over Russia. Russia is a weak, a medium-sized country, but tries to find a way of life together with Russia, even if the domestic political system is seen as disgusting, as is incidentally the domestic political system of Turkey, which is still a member of NATO.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, can we do this? Can we learn to moderate our temperament from the sort of American idea of a duty to protect everywhere in the world, which is a right to invade? Can we forget about this and concentrate on, let's say, civil society operations to try to convince the Russians to be a little more democratic? That's the question.
So a question which follows.
Let me add one point to this. Brexit in this context, to me, is a very important development because it tells the European Union that they cannot take away the sovereignty of other countries and govern them from above. In that sense, if they were willing to learn, they would have learned this. But as you see, the French and the Germans together try to make that exit as difficult as possible and as humiliating as possible in order to deter others to develop the same ideas.
But it sounds like it would be very difficult to recapture a horizontal dimension from the European Union without destroying its raison d'etre, effectively.
Not necessarily. If you look back historically, then well into the 1980s, we're talking about exactly that. The introduction of full free trade, the internal market, that was 1992 at the pressure of the French. Before that, there were all sorts of possibilities for a protectionist national policy. There should have been more, but there were. And 1992 was the four freedoms. Only then, including capital, including a clause in the treaties that is not well known outside of neoliberal circles, namely that capital would be free, not just to move inside the European Union, but it was explicitly not allowed for member states to prevent capital from moving into third countries. Yeah, we in the treaties accepted a principle of capital mobility, even beyond the borders of Europe, not just beyond the borders of the member countries.
No, that's a crucial point, the free movement of capital and what that means for European politics. I guess to kind of, not to end on a falsely optimistic note, given your kind of reluctance towards optimism, but and I think something that you don't, the essays don't necessarily give is any easy solutions or any kind of, straightforward paths for the left to take. Although in a lecture at the LSE last year, I do remember you making the argument that sometimes the tool needed to democratize the state is an AK-47. I think it's a great line, and I remember it caused a lot of pearl clutching in the lecture theatre. Could you expand on that line a little bit, or maybe more generally, what the question of what is the task facing the left today? What should we be trying to do given the analysis that we've been talking about?
Yeah, no, I'm a sociologist, and I'm a sort of strange mixture of a libertarian and a Marxist, and in both my intellectual heritages, it is clear that the state is an institution that controls violence and tries to make violence legitimate, and that politics is sometimes about contesting the violence of a state that cannot gain legitimacy from its citizens, and then what results could be a revolution. And I think I said that in the context that you should never forget when you talk about, let's say, countries in Africa or some countries in Asia, that there are situations in which responsible citizens may not see an alternative to taking up arms and fighting their government. That is an old insight of European political theory, right? And remember that the United States are proud of having come out of a revolutionary war. Right? Now in that sense, I would add that I said this sort of flippantly in order to remind the young students who see the world simply in terms of a debating place where you convince others of the better ideas and then they do that they misunderstand the power of gravity in politics, which is always about the control of violence. So then it occurs to me now that I would like to add the following. Violence is something I learned this from Engels. I think you might have seen my article on Friedrich Engels in the last or second to last issue of New Left Review.
We discussed it in one of our recent episodes in the Reading Club. That's for listeners if they want to go check that out.
Now, reading Engels was very important for me to confirm what I said in a more flippant way in that lecture at the LSE, and that was that politics will always have to include the possibility and the responsible thinking about what are the situations in which violence can be needed to undo an unjust government or system. My favorite example in this context is Nelson Mandela, one of the great peacemakers of history, someone who I admire more than I think anyone else in my generation. And so he was on this place, Robben Island, and once a year, 20 years or so, once a year the government came and told him he could go wherever he wanted on one condition, that he distance himself from the armed struggle. And what did he say? He said, go home. I will never do that. In the end, he was able to make a peaceful deal and preside over the peaceful transition of his country into a new time. What I learned from this is that there are situations in which the violent side of politics cannot be denied and has to be included into the. But of course, in our countries, I'm not talking about these countries, but I'm talking about countries on the periphery of modern capitalism, and if you say something like this, people become so they are shocked. But when you talk to Monsieur. When you talk to Monsieur Macron or his chief of staff, then they would, as a matter of course, assume that AK-47s, of course, they use much more sophisticated equipment, are importantly needed to keep friendly governments in power in Mali, in wherever. Yeah, it is something that the governments reserve this option for themselves, and they build up the most sophisticated equipment for the purpose. But if someone on the left reminds them that politics may very well be based on violent force, they consider this a scandal.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think it's such a great line, and definitely one worth bearing in mind if it comes to that at some point. But thanks so much for joining us, Wolfgang, and for Patreon subscribers, we'll be having a reading club precisely on Wolfgang's Critical Encounters in the new year. So thanks again, Wolfgang, and thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, George. Thanks to you all, and it was fun. It was very long, and now I'm tired and I need to have a beer.
Very good. Cheers to you.
Wonderful.